I'm so excited to introduce from Power Rank, make some noise for Mr. Ed Feng!
Thanks, Jimmy. I appreciate the intro. And you know, it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon. It's after lunch. It's siesta time. The conference is almost over. And who do they give you to talk? The Asian guy with the PhD that's going to talk about math. Zach, thanks, man. Appreciate that. But no, I want to make a pact with you guys. We're going to talk about analytics. But here's our pact. 1, no equations. 2, simple insights. Okay, so I'm going to tell you sites to visit, simple things that you want to keep in mind when you're handicapping certain types of leagues, no Excel spreadsheets, no importing data, none of that junk. Okay, I'm going to structure the talk in terms of 3 short stories. And the first story is, which computer rankings do you want to choose? So you have a lot of choices, especially in college football. You can go to Ken Massey's website. He's got 117 different college football rankings. Okay? You're clearly not going to go through all of those. So how do you sort through that clutter? And the first thing to note is that you know, what do computer rankings do? And at its most basic level, computer rankings take some kind of input. We're going to talk a lot about what input it takes over the next 10 minutes. But it takes this input, and then it adjusts for strength of schedule. Okay, and we all kind of get what strength of schedule means, especially in college football. Teams in the SEC play a much more difficult schedule than teams in the Sun Belt. Teams in the Big Ten play a much more difficult schedule than teams in the MAC. We all know this intuitively. How do we get the math to account for that? Computer polls. So I started thinking about computer polls and which ones that you want to look at during the BCS era. So you guys all remember the Bowl Championship Series. So it was the system for college football to match the first and the second ranked teams in the country. And it sucked. Everyone knew we needed a playoff. But the thing to remember about the BCS, it was a lot better than what came before. Because before then, it was just a bowl system, and you would never have a chance of getting 1 versus 2. So along comes the BCS, and how did they decide who the top 2 teams were? Well, they used a combination of human polls. These are AP coaches, stuff like that, and then also these computer polls. And these computer polls were supposed to give you know, some legitimacy to the BCS, right? But it was a little curious about these computer polls because what the BCS dictated was they said you're not allowed to use margin of victory in games. You are not allowed to use margin of victory in games in your calculations. Okay? And the idea was that the NCAA didn't want to encourage running up the score. Okay? So it just matters if you win or if you lose. So this got me thinking, well, is that a good idea? You know, how can we test these ideas? So what makes the best rankings? And we kind of have these 2 ideas of margin of victory that we think might be a useful thing for algorithms and then adjusting for strength of schedule. So I devised the test for how to test the quality of some rankings. Okay? So first, we can just figure out rankings that have neither margin of victory or adjust for strength of schedule. And so we're just ranking teams by wins and losses or the winning percentage. And what we can do to test this is just really simple. College football bowl games, it's a neutral site. The higher ranked team should win more often than not, right? So the test of these ranking systems is how often the higher ranked team beats a lower ranked team. So with winning percentage, so if you just guessed at random, you'd probably get about 50% of the games right. If you rank teams by wins and losses or their winning percentage, it goes up to 52%. So it's not much better than guessing at random. What else can you do? Well, you can take wins and losses and adjust for strength of schedule. And one algorithm that did this was something called the Colley matrix. So this was one of the BCS computer polls. And the nice thing about the Colley matrix is he wrote down all the math, so you could reproduce the results. And the math is really nice. It's some really beautiful mathematics, linear algebra, all kinds of nice things in there. But at its core, it only took wins and losses into account when it ranked teams. And when you use the Colley matrix, you get about 56% of the higher ranked team beating the lower ranked team. Now, what happens when you rank teams by raw margin of victory? Okay? Margin of victory is just you take the points scored for a team, subtract the points allowed, divide by the number of games. Well, that actually does better than the Kali matrix. It gets almost 59% of the bowl games right. Okay, so 59% of the games. And when you do just raw margin of victory, you kind of see how stupid it is. So you would see that North Dakota, if you go back a couple years ago, like a North Dakota State that played an FCS schedule would be ranked ahead of Alabama, things like that. So in some sense, that kind of thing doesn't pass the stupid test, but it still gets about 59% of the games right. And then you can actually go take margin of victory and adjust for strength of schedule. And now you're getting over 60%. So there's something called simple rating system. If you've ever been on the sports reference sites, that's the rankings that they use for college football, NFL. They get about 61%. I've developed my own algorithm at the Power Rank that also predicts about 61% of bowl game winners. And what's the intuition here? Well, the idea is that if you're the 5th ranked team and you go to the 2nd ranked team on the road and you only lose by a point, if you're only looking at wins and losses, you get docked for that. When in reality, you probably played a pretty good game to be within 1 point of a very good team on the road. So when you incorporate margin of victory, in your calculations, this is what leads to good computer rankings that can actually make a prediction that you might want to bet on. Okay, can we get the first slide? So just to show you the stupidity of not using margin of victory, so this is a shot from the 2012 national championship game in college football. These dark guys are Notre Dame, and that guy's, I think it's Eddie Lacy. So if you remember back to that season, Alabama, they lost the game somewhere along there. I think they lost to Texas A&M, but they made the national championship game. Notre Dame went undefeated. They went 12-0, kind of squeaked by some bad teams, but they made the national championship game. If you remember, Alabama obliterated them. So both these teams ended up with 1 loss. And what I really like is that the Kali matrix ranked Notre Dame ahead of Alabama after this game. What the fuck? That doesn't make any sense at all. So you need to consider margin of victory in these games. Okay. So there's a couple places that I obviously recommend my own site. That's a little biased. Jeff Sagarin has rankings. He's the oldest mathematician that started doing this stuff that's still relevant today, but his stuff is still pretty good. There's another site called Dr. Entropy that I often look at. And as I showed before, simple rating system is not a bad system. So just go to the sports reference sites. Those are the type of college football rankings that you want to look at. OK, so college football strength of schedule adjustments are really important. NFL, they're not as important. But I still suggest that you make them. And I want to give you an example of why. So let's think back to the Super Bowl between Carolina and Denver a couple years ago. And the other thing that I want to mention about these strength of schedule adjustments, it doesn't necessarily just have to be margin of victory. You can do efficiency ratings. And I'm going to talk about yards per pass attempt in this example. So Carolina, if you looked at their offense, their yards per pass attempt, and you look at them before the Super Bowl, they had the 5th best yards per pass attempt. Okay, remember, this is Cam Newton's Pro Bowl year. Not Pro Bowl year, MVP year. He went into the playoffs, destroyed Arizona, destroyed Seattle. I might have the order of that mixed up. But they were 5th in yards per attempt. But when I made strength of schedule adjustments on my site, they actually ranked 11th. Okay, and there's a pretty big difference between 5th and 11th. So what we were seeing is that they probably played some pretty bad defenses, and that was true. So I'm sorry, I had a whole full set of slides. This one wasn't going to show up, but I've shown all 32 pass defenses by my system, and I've highlighted the ones in which the defenses that Carolina played. All the pass defenses that they played were in the bottom half. Not all. Most of the pass defenses they played were in the bottom half of the NFL. And particularly when you looked at the teams in the NFC South in their division, Tampa Bay was 19th. Okay, played those guys twice. Atlanta was 24th. Played those guys twice. New Orleans was last in the NFL in pass defense by my adjusted numbers that year. Played those guys twice. Okay? So Carolina's pass offense wasn't as good as we expected. They faced a really good Denver defense in the Super Bowl. They got upset in the Super Bowl. They probably should have won that game. They had a lot of things go against them. But one of the things that you could have gotten from these adjusted numbers is that they were going to have a pretty tough time against a good Denver defense. All right, so my second story is how to make accurate preseason college football rankings. And next slide, please. So college football seems so random. You got 18 to 22-year-old boys, very hormonal, at a stage in life where they make bad decisions. And you're kind of trying to judge judge your actions off what these young kids will do. I know I didn't make very good decisions in that same age range. And I certainly know if I were Jameis Winston and leading the hopes and prayers of a program like Florida State, I might not have done so well. And then beyond that, you have the effect of just randomness of football. So this is the college football playoff. That's Jameis Winston. I don't know if you guys remember. He goes back. He just loses the football. Falls right into the hands of Tony Washington, that's right here, who rumbles in for a touchdown. Part of the demolition in which Oregon beat Florida State. But in college football, we have something that really helps us make preseason college football rankings. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, you can actually see this. OK, so what I've plotted here, each of these dots are teams. And on the x-axis is the rating for the end of the season in 2015. And then I plotted against how that team turned out in 2016. Okay? There's a diagonal line here. That's not a best fit line. That's the line in which the ratings are equal. So if your team landed right on that line, that means you had the same rating in 2015 as you had in 2016. Okay? So say that's maybe Stanford. Say they're 10 points better than average. That would be their rating. That rating means they would be expected to beat an average college football team by 10 points. That would be the predicted point spread. And what this graph shows is, like, year to year, these teams tend to hug this line. So if you have a team like Rice that sucks down here, if they had a bad rating one year, they don't really make jumps up to having a good rating the next year. Teams tend to persist from year to year. And this is true in college football. This is not true in the NFL. You cannot apply this model to the NFL at all. But in college football, we get this persistence of teams from year to year. Programs like Alabama, Ohio State, what do they have? Financial resources, winning tradition, recruiting prowess. These are all things that programs like Rice will never have. Okay? So the Alabama does not trade places with Rice. And that's what this is meant to show. Teams persist from year to year. So you can make a preseason model in college football based on that. And so there's three components to my model. And the first takes advantage of this persistence. So I look at the last 4 years of team performance and evaluating how that team is going to project to the next year. The second component to the preseason model is turnovers. So you guys know, if you ever watch football, turnovers can have a huge impact on games. Turnovers will impact a team's rating. So for example, if a team like Washington was plus 18 in turnovers last year, that probably helped their rating. That probably helped what my system said they were going to do on a neutral site against an average college football team. So we have to account for that. And essentially what it's saying is, like, well, a team like Washington, they were plus 18 in turnovers later. Well, we expect that. We can't predict what their turnover margin is going to be this year. So we bring them back a little bit. We bring them a little bit closer to the mean because they had a little bit of this turnover luck. And then the third factor in the preseason model is returning starters. This is not a surprise. If you were good last year, you had a lot of people returning back. The next year, the numbers say you should continue to be good. So this preseason model, it's simple, and we can talk about its flaws, and we're going to in a sec. But over the last 3 years, it's predicted more than 70% of the game winners in college football games. So more than 70%. To put that in perspective a little bit, this is not including FCS cupcake teams. Okay? Those games are excluded because I'm only ranking FBS teams. I'm not making, I guess I could make a prediction, but I'm not making a prediction on those cupcake games. So you can actually do some pretty powerful computer rankings in college football in the preseason. Okay, so preseason rankings for 2017, they're up on my site. Definitely go check them out. Alabama's at the top. I don't think that's too much of a surprise. They're almost 23 points better than the average FBS team. Clemson's number 2, 18 points better than the average college football team. That might be a little bit of a surprise just because they don't have Deshaun Watson, who I believe was, I think was a once-in-a-generation talent to play at quarterback for them. A lot of systems have them a little bit lower. My system doesn't account for Deshaun Watson specifically because he's the quarterback. Okay, he just gets lumped in as the returning stars. So you'll find him lower. Clemson, it might be a little bit high for Clemson for that reason. 3, Florida State. 4, Ohio State. 5, Oklahoma. No one's really gonna. I don't think many people are gonna argue with that top 5. 6 is Auburn, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around. They were a surprise last year. I think they played a lot better than many people expected, and they're getting Jarrett Stidham at quarterback this year, and we saw that he was pretty good in a very small sample size at Baylor. 7th, Stanford, where I went to grad school, and no adjustment for that, no personal bias in there. 8, Wisconsin, 9, Michigan, 10, LSU. So you can just go to my site and check those out. Now, I do want to talk about, I did have to make an adjustment for Michigan. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a plot of the 30 years of team history of Michigan, but I just want to, this is the rating on the bottom slide, okay? So they won a lot of games. These are the 3 Rich Rod years. Brady Hoke comes back, was good his first year and then kind of dives, and this is the last year of the Hoke era. And then Harbaugh took over the last 2 years and they've come back up. And my model says we need to look over the last 4 years of Michigan's team performance. But clearly Harbaugh wasn't responsible for 2 of those years, those last years. And that's one thing that's dragging Michigan down. I was a little horrified when they showed up 30th by the raw numbers. So next slide, please. But we expect better because he's Jim Harbaugh, and I know I'm a little biased because I live in Ann Arbor. But this is what the man did at Stanford. They were a pretty awful program, and these highlighted years here show just the steep rise that he brought that program to. So what I did there was I took some market values to adjust Michigan's rating. So I said, well, how many games do I expect them to win? And they got 4 games that are going to be tough. They open at Florida, they're at Wisconsin, they're at Ohio State, and then they're home against Ohio State. So if we just can think of those as toss-up games, maybe they go 2-2 in those games. They have another 8 games. They're going to be a pretty big favorite in a lot of those games, but odds are they're going to drop one of them. None of those games is 100%. And just like last year when they went to and went to Iowa as a big favorite, a lot of things can happen. You can drop a game. So I expect them to win about 9 games. That's exactly what the market value is. That's exactly what the market value is. And so when you adjust their rating in my preseason model, they end up 9th to kind of make that match. All right. So we have college football preseason rankings. We can take that and we can get win totals. So the ratings are one thing, and that's how you would do against an average team, like I talked about before. But to predict win totals, you need to know the details of the schedule. Okay? So if you play a tough schedule, you're going to be predicted to win fewer games. And just as an example, Wisconsin's ranked 8th. They're predicted to win 9.6 games. They have a really easy schedule. Their hardest game is Michigan at home. And Michigan's 9th. They're not too far behind them in terms of rating, how many points better they are on a neutral site. But Michigan's only predicted, it ended up with 8.8 wins, 8.8 games. So college football win totals, I give these all out to people who sign up for my email list. So you can do that at thepowerrank.com. Okay. So next slide, please. So the last thing I want to talk about, this is my 3rd short story, is passing and rushing in the NFL. So this is a picture before the Giants played the Bills in the Super Bowl. The Bill Parcells was the head coach, but we want to focus on the guy on the left, who's Bill Belichick, and he was the Giants' defensive coordinator. And before the game, he went into the locker room and said, we need to let Thurman Thomas rush for 100 yards. And the Giants' defenders were horrified. They're like, what? We pride ourselves on stopping the run. This is Carl Banks and all these big dudes. So you imagine a little white guy over there telling these large men that you need to let Thurman Thomas rush for 100 yards. And this is a story that has been widely told. I read about it in David Halberstam's book about Belichick a long time ago, and I was like, that's crazy. Like, why would he let Thurman Thomas run for 100 yards? Well, analytics is actually on its side. Next slide, please. Okay, so passing dominates the NFL, and we all know that. We all know it's a quarterback league. But what's kind of surprising is the insignificance of rushing. Okay? And I'm trying to show that in that plot, and I'm going to take you through this. So what this shows for all playoff teams is their rushing and passing efficiency. And we do it for a team. So what I do is I take the yards per play on offense, and I subtract the yards per play allowed on defense. Okay? So better teams will have good offenses that tend to gain more yards per play. Better defenses will allow fewer yards per play, so that's why we subtract that value. And I'm trying to show that, okay, so these are, I understand you can't see these well. The points are all the playoff teams. And what this is supposed to show is that the team pass efficiencies for all the playoff and the Super Bowl teams tend to be high. Teams that win the Super Bowl, teams that make the playoffs, tend to throw the ball well. They tend to defend the pass pretty well. There's a couple teams that were below NFL average and won the Super Bowl. This is 2007. That's the New York Giants when they went up against the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, when Randy Moss, Tom Brady were going after the perfect season. One of the biggest upsets in Super Bowl history here. This is the New England Patriots, early days of Bill Belichick and Tom Brady. They went into the Super Bowl against these big dots are supposed to be the teams that lost the Super Bowl. They went into the Super Bowl against the St. Louis Rams, Kurt Warner and the greatest show on turf. Another one of the biggest upsets in Super Bowl history. So there's a small sample size in playoffs. Clearly, teams that don't pass that well during the regular season can do well. But the majority of playoff and the majority of Super Bowl teams throw the ball and defend the pass well. But the story's completely different with rushing. And if you could see this well, you would see that the rushing efficiencies for the teams is a random scatter of positive and negative values. It's a random scatter. So there's a lot of teams that don't really run the ball well or defend the run and still make the playoffs and tend to win Super Bowls. So one team is the Indianapolis Colts. So from 2003 to 2010, they won 99 games over 8 years. I think they won at least 12 games every year until the last season in which they won 10 games. And a lot of that was the pass offense. Peyton Manning was good throughout that entire time. Even their pass defense was good for a couple years. But they were only better than NFL average in team rush efficiency once during that era. And now on the flip side, you have a team like the Minnesota Vikings during that same era. They led the NFL in team rush efficiency 4 times. They were third another 2 times. But in none of those seasons did they really make any waves. And the only season that they were really successful was 2009, and that's when Brett Favre was their quarterback. They were very efficient throwing the ball, made the playoffs at 12-4, and came within a couple plays of making the Super Bowl in the NFC Championship game. So passing is king in the NFL, not a surprise. Rushing is very insignificant to winning, according to the data. And I think that might be maybe a surprise to you guys. So is this trend going to continue? Is the NFL going to continue to be a passing league? Next slide, please. Well, to kind of look at that, we got to look at the history of what's going on here. So this top slide, this is a plot. This starts in 1978. And this shows the fraction of plays that are passes. So the rules changed in 1978. Offensive linemen can now use their hands to block. Defensive backs could no longer put their hands on the receivers more than 5 yards from the line of scrimmage. And so teams started throwing the ball more. And we've seen a very steady increase in the rate of passing in the NFL, especially since the turn of the century. But even, when you think that teams are going to throw more, the defenses would adjust. They would start, putting multiple defensive backs in the game. They would start really trying to defend the pass at the expense of the rush. And the efficiency at which teams throw the ball would decrease. But that really hasn't been the case. This red line is yards per play on the average, on the NFL average yards per pass attempt. And you can see that despite the fact that the NFL is throwing the ball more, the efficiency still is going up. So this is good. I mean, this is good if you're you should throw the ball, right? Because even if you throw it more, the NFL average is still increasing. And this blue line is yards per carry. It's essentially stagnated since the late 70s. I mean, it's a little bit higher, but not by very much. And then, the NFL, the passing game is really the gift that keeps giving, because this bottom line is the interception rate. And it was greater than 5% in the late 70s, and it just keeps dropping. You can kind of see this linear decrease. And the NFL had a low of 2.2% of passes ended up in the other team's hands. So I think this is really amazing. The NFL keeps throwing the ball more, it keeps getting more efficient, and it keeps getting safer. So I don't think that trend is going to change anytime soon. And what's the take-home message with this? Well, you don't spend too much time handicapping rushing. Winning depends all on the passing game in the NFL. And you can think about this in terms of injuries. Like, obviously, you need to adjust for the quarterback, skill position guys. But really think about the cornerbacks. Really think about the pass rushers. Running back gets hurt. I don't know. I mean, Ezekiel Elliott's backup's probably going to be all right behind that offensive line. And so that is the end of my third story. That is the end of my talk. There's a fourth story. It's in these letters. And if you ask me a question, I'd be more than happy to give you one of these. And then you get to talk to Miriam, and Allison is not here, but you get their beautiful presence in your midst as well. So thank you very much.
So the analytics and the math is all new to me. But can you explain a little bit when you say 50%, 55%, 60% accuracy? Is that just straight up or against the spread? And then how do you need to adjust for those numbers?
Yeah, so that first thing that I talked about when I talked about the rankings, that was just, that was not any kind of ATS. That was just to say, like, what ingredients do we want in our model? And the value kind of doesn't matter. It just, the thing that you should take home from that is that when you put margin of victory, your ability to make predictions goes way up, as opposed to not using margin of victory.
It goes way up for money. It goes way up for a money line wager.
No. Just goes. Your ability to predict the outcome of a game goes up when you start considering margin of victory. And honestly, this isn't really a problem in the NFL, because a lot of the good sites are using, like, they're not just taking wins and losses and trying to make predictions. The problem is when you go into college football, there's a lot of lousy computer rankings that you should never look at because they don't consider something as simple as margin of victory in games. So don't worry about the values.
Hi, Ed. I just wanted to ask, because you are taking turnovers out of the equation, or you're considering that they don't make a huge difference in the result of the game. But some of them are forced. So do you view them differently if they're forced or unforced?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Okay, so I do not take them out. It's more that I consider them.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I consider them, and the idea is, we'll take Washington. They were plus 18 in turnovers last year. The math says that plus 18 in turnover margin has zero ability to predict what's going to happen this year. So essentially in the model, they get docked a little bit that some of their performance was due to the randomness of turnovers. Clearly, some turnovers are forced, when you watch the play. But for me, from a mathematical perspective, it's really difficult to predict which turnovers are forced. So you could say, oh, better defenses force more turnovers. But that's just not true in the numbers. And in fact, you get a little bit, I mean, it's a little bit, you can get some information with interceptions, but like I've literally found no variable that correlates with fumbles in college football. Like none. So it doesn't matter how good your defense is, it doesn't matter, you know, I mean, surely there is exceptions, but when you look at college football as a league and what's going on, it's really hard to predict. It's really hard to take one variable and say, okay, I expect this team to force more fumbles on average. Does that make sense?
It doesn't help you predict the outcome of the game at all if you factor in turnovers.
Well, if you could predict turnovers, yeah, you would definitely get an edge. And there's, you know, I do know some people that will try to predict interceptions, which you can do a very little bit. But what I'm saying is it's
maybe
hard.
like rushing the quarterback is probably, you know, where I think maybe if you rush the quarterback well, then maybe you can predict the high level of turnovers.
I'm trying to.
If you've got a quarterback that sits in the pocket, you know, then or stands in the pocket, then.
For sure. And I'm all in favor of you guys making those adjustments for particular teams. But what I found is that, you know, if you want to say one variable over all of college football or the NFL is going to predict fumbles or interceptions, that's a really hard thing to do.
But if you put it in the model, then you don't get a better outcome. You don't get a no.
No, because the model says no, there's no difference.
All right, okay, well then that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ed. Great talk, great speech.
Thanks.
Let me ask you, doing numbers as you do, how much do you put into teams or situations regressing to the mean? You stated Washington Huskies last year, plus 18 net turnovers. And it's highly unlikely that we're going to see plus 18 net turnovers for Washington again this year. And that does equate into their point spread success, the benefit of that. Is it coaching? Is it randomness? What do you put into a possible return to the mean?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't mention this. The preseason model is a regression model, so that's naturally baked into it. You know, teams like Alabama always get pulled a little bit back towards the mean just because they're the outlier there. That's obviously kind of a tough thing. So there is regression in there. And, you know, maybe Alabama is a good team to explain that with because, you know, what can go wrong with Alabama this year? Well, what can go wrong is they scored 12 touchdowns on defense and special teams. And that's a number I don't think they're going to come close to this year. So in some sense, the model does consider that regression, and that's just one particular thing that I don't think is going to happen again for Alabama. And that's one reason that you get the regression back to the mean for top teams like Alabama. Thanks for the question.
Hey Ed, how you doing?
Great.
Question I have is when we heard the Vegas bookie guy that was on the other side, he said he looked at analytics, and he also used the human element to make the final decision. How much of that do you use to forecast your 70% win rate?
Yeah, so the 70% win rate has nothing to is just pure numbers, and that's just to give you some sense of the idea of the ability we have to predict college football. I mean, I completely agree with Matt Holt. Like, you should always be some human judgment before you set a line, put down a wager. I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, you always use human judgment. I'm not someone who just looks at the numbers and said, "Hey, let's go."
Sup, Ed? First time, long time. Quick question: Could your system also be translated into like a college basketball, maybe, like using kind of the same points?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things I do on my site is March Madness analytics. I do the same team rankings, predicting the outcome of the tournament, win probabilities, and then also, yeah, I mean, definitely point spreads during the course of the year. You know, for my business, I choose to focus mostly on football and then March Madness because that's when I see the most interest. But I mean, I definitely do some college football. College basketball. You can definitely apply it to that, and it's a pretty data-rich thing compared to football, so it can be pretty interesting. you.
So Ed, as you to follow up the question that was asked by the gentleman up here, as far as the human element and how it impacts statistics, I was actually, my question was dealing with how do you foresee the application of qualitative variables in future predictions? So what are some of those impacts, maybe team rivalries, other issues like that that seem to show some correlation, if not always a direct? If you could touch up on that for me, please.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, yeah, I think those things are definitely worth looking at. Rivalries, I mean, especially something like rivalries where you have some historical data to check it, you should do it. I mean, I personally haven't done it, but I definitely feel like that's a good thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely something that you should look at. But you're talking about the human judgment element as well? Yeah, I mean, that's just something, the way I go about it is I, try to understand the basics of kind of regression to the mean and what math says in general, and then I try to apply it to particular situations. I'm trying to think. So Gonzaga last year was, they were well ahead of every other college basketball team heading into the tournament by my points-based numbers. And it was something that kind of didn't make sense because, it was a team that no one really expected to do. It wasn't like a preseason top 5 team. Clearly a talented team, clearly a good program. But, I mean, that was the suggestive adjustments that I made to say that, yeah, I don't think Gonzaga is 3 points better than North Carolina on a neutral court. And so, I didn't talk about this, but preseason polls are actually pretty powerful predictors of postseason performance. So, you can kind of use that to say, okay, well, maybe this team is too high. And then I do calculations where I take point spreads, and then I use the same algorithm to adjust for strength of schedule. And that showed that kind of Gonzaga and North Carolina were on the same footing, essentially about the same. I think North Carolina was slightly ahead. So I guess that's just an example where, you have an idea because you follow this stuff and you understand regression to the mean, and so you make some human adjustment, and then you try to back that up with data, and that's usually the best way.
Hey, how's it going, Ed?
Great, where are you?
Right here, right here. It's me,
awesome.
It's Breadman. Hey, I have a question I think that all of us might kind of want to know. With all of your historical data that you've compiled over the last few years and your preseason assessments that you were just speaking of, is there any specific statistical trend that we should be looking out for this year, either with college football or NFL football? Hey, thanks, buddy.
A single statistical trend.
Yeah, whether it be as simplified as such as a tail or a fade or just something that we should be keeping an eye on, something that jumped out to you.
Yeah, well, here, I'll talk about this for a little bit, and then you can tell me if this answers your question. So I've been thinking about the one-hit wonders in college football last year. So teams I'm talking about are Washington, performed very much better than, well, I guess Bill Connolly was high on him, and he's both a friend and a competitor in terms of doing this stuff. But he was very high on him. I thought they way overperformed. I didn't believe in Chris Peterson. So they had a great season, obviously. USC, in the sense that they had an amazing 9 games with Sam Darnold. And then Penn State is another one of these one-hit wonders. So just to put Penn State in context, like their offensive line was kind of decimated from sanctions and injuries and stuff when they went on that absurd run in the last 9 games of the season. And you just kind of wonder, is like, how much of that, they obviously played well. I'm not trying to take that away from them, but was that something that's reproducible? And those are 3 teams that, my numbers are going to have lower than polls. You can compare it to the preseason coaches poll that just came out yesterday. So those are that's a trend that, and I guess the story is the same in the sense that those 3 programs haven't performed over the last 4 years where humans are putting them in their polls.
Right. Okay.
So that's one thing. And, I expect one of those teams to actually not be a one-hit wonder, but I expect 2 of those teams to kind of regress.
So we could potentially have 2 tankers there.
I think so. We'll see. We'll talk about it in December.
Thank you.
Yeah, and again, Justin, that just goes back to what Mark was talking about too, like regression to the mean. That's exactly.
So Ed, great presentation, and you're doing a great job with the Q&A. But I've got a real question about the stats for college football. I have a lot of issues with the mainstream stats.
Yep.
Where you have a bad snap on a punt that ends up with negative 67 rushing yards, and you know,
Right.
I mean, I find that statistics-based college football handicapping, from my perspective, is a negative ROI.
Okay.
Number one, I want to ask, where do you get your college football stats? Because you're going to find
Right.
difference between the ESPN numbers and the numbers and the NCAA puts out versus other sites.
Right.
Significant differences oftentimes. And two, how confident are you in the stats that you're actually pumping into your algo that they're good numbers?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So first, with college football, there's a really troublesome problem on all the major media sites, and that's that they count sacks as rush plays in college football. So all the negative yards for sacks go into rush plays.
And that comes from the NCAA. That's not the mainstream sites. That's the way the NCAA does it.
Yeah, but all the mainstream sites copy them.
Yeah, they do. They use the NCAA formula.
Yeah,
that's
and
an
it's
NCAA.
garbage.
Yeah, I know.
So that's the first problem. And so you're adjusting for that. You're going to be fine with that.
Does your model adjust for that?
Well, I mean, before, it's not my model adjust for that. I just put those sack plays back into pass plays before I do any adjustments. So yes. But if you're not Teddy and you need better data on yards per attempt in both passing and rushing in college football, I have a page on my site that does the proper adjustment, putting sacks into pass plays. So just check it out. It's under rankings on my site. The next question, can you be confident about college football? I would say yes. I mean, I've been looking at my numbers for a long time. I trust them to tell me when a team is overrated in rush defense, when a team could be sneaky good in pass offense. And I think you're right in the sense that maybe we can't trust it because it's the smallest sample size that we get of any sport. I mean, we have a 12-game regular season, and you're always going to find issues there. I'm trying to think of a good example in college football. But, they always arise. And I think if you have doubts about college football numbers because of that, I think that's entirely legitimate. And I will tell you, things do tend to persist from year to year in college football, and that's just not for teams. Pass offense, pass defense, they all tend to persist. So you can get a little bit, you can get some better numbers if you use season data from the previous seasons. They can seem a little bit weird just because if a team's really kind of taken off like Penn State's rushing was last year. But that, on average, will help you. So this letter is about small sample size and the perils of small sample size. And it was something that got sent to members of my site. So if Matt doesn't ask a question, even if he does ask a question, I'm not giving him one because he got one last year.
Hey, Ed. So I put out a totals projection based on WAR for baseball every year.
Awesome.
And please don't do your own because it'd be better than mine. But I always have outliers. I get 2 or 3 teams that are 2 or more standard deviations away, from the model. But those outliers, or one-hit wonders, you just call them, that's where some serious value is. Is there any consistent threads of what those outliers, how they become to be?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's risk, but I do think you can get you can get some insight. Teams that make huge jumps in college football usually end up having a superstar quarterback. I remember thinking, I was like, who the hell is this Jameis Winston kid? Why do we think he's so great? I remembered not really believing in that Florida State team. And then he went out and just obliterated Pitt that Monday night, first weekend of the season. So in college football, definitely star players that can really change everything can give you those outlier seasons. I think Sam Darnold's good, but I don't know if he's the next Peyton Manning yet. We talked about the one-hit wonders. If Sam Darnold's really that good, that's going to be the team that's going to be able to outperform what my preseason rankings expect. Does that kind of answer your question? If you want to find those, maybe the Cubbies last year. You knew they had a ton of talent coming up to the majors that could perform at that level. maybe that's something. I mean, maybe that was an outlier for your baseball one last year. Mets. Wait, Mets up last year or down this year? Last year. Okay. Yeah, they're not. What?
Rockies this year.
Yeah, see the Rockies. So the Rockies are actually below average in my MLB stuff right now, which I think is going to be interesting going towards the postseason. So.
I know you just told me not to ask one, so now I'm definitely asking one. So you were talking earlier about the effectiveness of running games in NFL and using it as any type of predictive analytics, and I agree with that. But don't you think that in college football it can actually play a huge role? Look at Tulane last year, ran the ball 40% of the time the year before, ran the ball 69% of the time last year. Points improved from 18 to 24.
Yeah, Matt, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, the insignificance of rushing isn't the same in college football. I should have mentioned that. That is a very NFL thing. And then also, you know, I actually don't do any kind of like points-based NFL prediction because the persistence of teams in NFL just isn't the same. It doesn't work. You get garbage. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'm gonna give you this later.
Hi, Ed.
Hey.
So clearly the NFL is a pass-first league. So what does your system directly look for in terms of like cornerback size or cornerback hits? Is that what it's accounting for? Is it hits on the quarterback? What is it specifically looking for?
You know, it should be looking for more of that stuff. You know, what I do right now is I take points-based methods and I combine them with adjusted yards per attempt. So, well, Zach screwed up my slide, but I had the defensive rankings, offense defensive rankings for yards per play on pass defense. That's a huge, huge component of what I do with the NFL. I also do some market-based stuff, adjusted for schedule. But I think what you're talking about is kind of next level type of stuff, kind of evaluating personnel and maybe like, I mean, this is stuff that can be quantified, right? So we could look at cornerbacks and see, you know, how they performed. Cornerbacks are so hard. They don't get a lot of statistics, and they're so important. And it's one of these things where, like, you know, the best cornerbacks don't get a lot of pass breakups because no one throws at them. That's a really hard thing. And I think I've kicked around some ideas in my head of just like kind of aggregating subjective opinions of cornerbacks because I think it'd be really nice to have a 1 through 64 ranking of cornerbacks to make injury adjustments.
Can we get a big round of applause for Ed Feng, everybody? That was amazing. So insightful. Thanks, Bob.